tu regardes sur le...
Ici.
Il y a des gens qui posent des questions.
Ici.
Non, non, sur ton téléphone.
Ouais, ça marche. Okay, so welcome everyone. This is going to be a special talk by Paul-Olivier Dehaye. Paul-Olivier Dehaye is the founder and the director of personaldata.io, and he is also the board member of My Data Global and also heads the Geneva hub of My Data. And he has been very active around applications and approaches leveraging technology in helping in the issue of the pandemic. So we thought it would be a very good idea to have him here to share an update on the situation, what's happening, where we're at, especially in these times where things are pretty much getting, how can I say this, a little bit hectic maybe? Yes. So we'll see what updates we are up to here. So Paul-Olivier, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for sharing. You are being streamed live here on Periscope. And also, if you have any questions in the Zoom for the students, don't hesitate to take the mic and ask your questions. We'll be looking also at the comments. Yes?
It's on my Twitter.
So,
on my Twitter channel.
Paul-Olivier, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Henri. So yes, I think everything is working. So hi, everyone in the room. We're in Geneva in the FacLab. Thank you, Jean-Henri, for the invite at the University of Geneva. Thank you for the millions of people who are watching online. I don't know how many people are watching. Some are on Zoom, some are on Periscope. Just for context, indeed, we're in October 2020. Very recently in Geneva, there was a severe uptick in cases of COVID, very sharp increase also in France. Just to give some context for this talk, because things are moving very, very fast. So today I want to talk about COVID, contact tracing apps in particular, and essentially the past 6 months of developments in this area. Okay. So let's go back a little bit on a little bit about COVID. And by the way, for those who are on Twitter, you can ask your questions around the hashtag that is in the top right. Hopefully someone is monitoring in the room and relaying to me. Okay, so what do we know about COVID, or what did we know about COVID back in February, March? This was a very important graph back then. It's still an important graph. It shows the proportion of infections over time that are due to different means. Now the numbers have been a bit sharpened, but I still took the original picture. So you see on the x-axis, you see time, the number of days, goes from 0 to 12 in this picture. And on the vertical axis, you see the transmissions per day, the probability of transmission per day for the infected person. And you see that in dark blue is the symptomatic people who transmit. In light green is the environmental transmission. So someone touches a surface that has the virus, and then that's how they become infected eventually. In dark green is asymptomatic. And in light blue is pre-symptomatic. Okay, so people before symptoms who infect others. And the whole idea is to reduce the reproduction number of the epidemic, called R, to less than 1. And R can be read from this graph by integrating, by looking at the whole integral under the curve for this whole thing. And the big problem we have is that essentially, if you total the area under the curve of the dark blue and the other stuff, you're already past 1. Okay, so you have to do something that addresses the pre-symptomatic transmission. Okay, there is enough transmission that is pre-symptomatic that we have a serious problem because we can't just act once someone has symptoms. So the idea is to go from an R that is around 2, maybe 2.5, to an R below 1 by acting especially on the light blue area, the pre-symptomatic transmissions, using information extracted from the symptomatic transmissions, the dark blue ones, right? That's the main idea of contact tracing apps. So it's the main idea of contact tracing in general. So if you think of a contact graph, you have someone that is circled here that is infected, and they will have contacts with all kinds of people, and some of them will be infected, some of them will not be infected, some of them you will not know about them because that contact was not logged or was hidden from you if you're a doctor, and so on and so on. So that's a big problem because people interact in all kinds of ways, and there could be transmissions in all kinds of ways, right? Imagine someone on the subway coughing, spreading viruses, and infecting suddenly a ton of other people. So when you see this picture, how do you react, right? What do you think is the solution suddenly to the epidemic? Now, when many people saw this picture, their first reaction was to think the cell phones will save us. You can also have other ideas, right? You can also say, well, maybe we should wear masks. But in March, masks were very difficult to get. People were not convinced they could help. Today, everyone here has a mask. I even have a mask while I'm talking. But at the time, we're not talking about taking the subway with a mask. It was just inconceivable for Europeans to do that. We could also talk about not having people in the subway, right? We started cycling since we are going to have to do more remote work, more and more, taking less the subway, this type of efforts. But nevertheless, there is this hope that the cell phones that we're carrying will help. So again, this is what was understood early on in March. What can we do about this? We could wear masks, we could stop commuting or limit our commute or adapt our commute, or we could also use the cell phones. So that was the reaction for many. Let's build an app in March. Let's try to find a solution to this through an app. So one idea is to use this app to do contact tracing, right? So it's sort of what I explained before, travel this graph to try to find as quickly as possible people who are pre-symptoms, who don't have symptoms yet, right? So we can isolate them, quarantine them, whatever word you want to choose, and prevent that those people infect others. Okay, so here is a scenario. On day 1, subject A has COVID-19, but no symptoms yet, right? It's at the top here, and goes about their day normally. They go home, train, work, home, right? And they are in contact with a ton of other people. They live their life normally. And on day 2, they wake up, and finally they have symptoms. They awake with a fever. So they report the symptoms, they request a test, they do the test, they test positive. They instantly enter this information into an app, and this app instantly notifies all those people they've met the previous day, that they should really start acting as if they might have been infected. So what does that mean? They might socially distance more, they might take a test. They were even suggesting to do decontamination at some point. We have not discussed that in Europe much yet. But essentially, there's this very fast action trying to find the people that A has been in contact with since getting infected, and try to prevent those people from infecting further, essentially. Questions? No? Good? Right. So how do you log this with an app? How do you log all those contacts, B, C, D, etc., of A over the first day? So I'm here taking slides from a friend, co-author called Joel Reardon. One idea is to use Bluetooth. So Bluetooth is, of course, a protocol that is in everyone's smartphones nowadays. The idea is that one phone will send chirps, like advertising packets that will say, hey, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. And those will be captured by other phones. But they will not be captured as loudly by phones that are further away as the phones that are close by. So the message will degrade the further away you are, at least that's the theory. And that could be used maybe to do some ranging, some measure of distance. And as a consequence, to measure whether someone is at risk or not. All right, so that's the main idea for Bluetooth-based contact tracing. Yeah?
This was a system built by the French government, Stop COVID app, right?
We'll get into that in a second.
Okay.
Right, so at the moment it's just how do we measure distance? That's all I've talked about. Now, there's still a question, like, do we need to have everyone running the system, or are we happy with only some of them? So that depends highly on epidemiological parameters, but also on the infrastructure that we have in place for testing and for responding very quickly to a new event, like someone's infected and so on and so on. So there was a big study that came out that was very influential, that came out that basically measured the R, so this reproductive number per day so this is R per day, and this dark line is R equals 1, big R equals 1. So it's where the epidemic is just coasting, but not increasing, right? Not exponentially increasing. As a function on the x-axis of the percentage of cases that are isolated quickly, and on the y-axis, the percentage of contacts that are quarantined quickly, right? So this assumes instant effect, just instant. And yeah.
When you say quickly,
instant. So you see that, for instance, you need, okay, so, and this depends on what the R actually is, if it's 2, 2.5, or 3. Yes?
Because if it takes 3 days to get symptoms, or you get instant isolation, because just to get the alert, you need 3 days.
Yes, so it's you act instantly on information that you get from the app, and you get a test very, very quickly. So I think it's 1 day that in their model. So if you measure the proportion that are needed, you get, like, if you have 60% of people who isolate directly, you need around 50% of contacts traced by the app instantly, or traced instantly, which means presumably by the app, right? So it's a huge proportion. This is for reducing on its own the R that is 2.5 or something down to 1, right? With the app, no other intervention. Okay? Question? So once that paper came out, it became very influential, because indeed many different groups started working on this. And some money started pouring into developing those solutions. So there was a big grant from the Botnar Foundation, 20 million, but part of it was 5 million for the EPFL, so the research institution in Lausanne, for pioneering research programs, including for the development of a digitally scalable contact tracing system, with the long-term goal to support national health systems that have a strong focus on data privacy, GDPR compliance, and interoperability across borders. So that money went into EPFL, that was at the time working with a consortium of European academics and companies called PEPP, Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing, Pan-European Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing. So that system was built on a centralized model, meaning that the state would essentially aggregate information about whose phone was in contact with who, right? And would also, of course, aggregate information about who tested positive. And from that, they could start predicting who might be at risk, and they could start acting. So this centralized model was pushed by Germany and France primarily, and this led eventually to Stop COVID, the French app. Okay. Now there was a competing model that also came from EPFL actually, and it was born partly within the first consortium, and that model was decentralized. It's called DP3T. The model there, and I'll try to explain the technology fairly quickly, is that the phones say permanently identifiers. They just broadcast identifiers all the time, right? So that's the same as with the centralized system. But those broadcasts that are sent are kept on each other's phones and never sent to the central system. The identifiers are generated based on secret keys. So you have a secret key for this phone on that day, a secret key for this phone on that day. And from there, there's a sequence of IDs that are generated at different times, deterministically from that, okay? So you have a whole chain of identifiers that is started from the secret key. All right, questions? That's what they are saying. And they're also listening. So they're listening to each other, right? So this phone will have heard a bunch of other identifiers. What the phone doesn't know yet is that all of those identifiers there that are boxed come from the same other phone. They don't know that, but they've heard it. And later on, someone tests positive. So when they test positive, they send their key. They are infected, they send their key to the central server that belongs to the health authority. Right? They send their own key. That's the main difference with the centralized system. It's called decentralized. It's a confusing word, but they do send their own keys, own private keys, keys that were private this far, to a central server run by the health authority. All right? And then what all the other phones do is that they listen to whose keys have been revealed as infected by the central health authority. And everyone else's phone takes those infected keys into their own system and then tries to figure out, okay, those secret keys were used to generate identifiers that were broadcast. Did I hear any of those identifiers? Okay? Does that make sense? So this phone deduces that they've had 7 risky encounters with 2 individuals because it corresponds to 2 different keys, maybe on the same day. Okay? So the main difference between the centralized and the decentralized system is that, or the so-called centralized and decentralized, is that the decentralized system only uploads to the health authority the key of infected people, right? In the so-called centralized system, like Stop COVID, what gets uploaded is all the contacts of infected people. So a little part of the social graph, of the graph of interactions. But this is deemed risky by some because, and it is risky, because it means that the health authority or the state or and so on can start deducing social relationships between people, which we would prefer to avoid, of course. So that was essentially in March, April, there was a big debate, on April, there was a big debate where security researchers were essentially deciding how we would fight the epidemic with digital tools. They were making very consequential decisions, very broad statements about what should be done with no epidemiological information coming into their arguments. It was just about security. It was a big fight, and to be honest, it wasn't completely honest all the time. The arguments were going all around and were not fully rational always, or even just in good faith all the time. It was not always about seeking the best solution. Part of the time it was also about making the other solution fail, which was in the context of a pandemic, so it raises a lot of question about the actions of that whole community. I mean, the security community should have never been in charge of this on its own. But a big change happened April 10th, where Google and Apple essentially decided for everyone. Because what they said was more or less, we pick the decentralized model, we like that one better, and we'll not help the centralized one. Right? So we'll not help PEPP, but we'll help DP3T and systems like it. When I say not help the centralized one, it means that they're not going to do critical changes that the centralized model needed, but also the decentralized model needed, which was that phones would be capable of listening on the always to Bluetooth chirp, right? So this was prevented in on Apple phones for privacy reasons, so that precisely someone doesn't start building an app that starts listening to chirps all the time because it's privacy invasive. So Apple resisted making the change that the centralized model needed. And instead what they did is they chose the decentralized model and they implemented it themselves with some limitations on what could be done. Right? So that is problematic in my view because it amounts to a technological coup. It amounts to tech companies deciding, it's no longer security researchers that are deciding how we fight the epidemic. It's now tech companies that are deciding what we can do in the digital space to fight the epidemic. Questions? Yeah, Simon.
Is that of course not new, like we cannot even choose the license of the software on the Apple Store, right?
Right, so you're saying we can't even choose the license on our software in the Apple Store, so there's nothing new here.
What I'm saying is like, we have a perfect use case of the problem, but it's something that we know for a long time that is going to happen.
Well, that you have known for a long time that was going to happen. So I think this event is important because suddenly a lot of people realize, oh, they can do that? Incredible, right? So it's something that tons of people have said for a long time, but yes. Which is also disingenuous when you hear some of the arguments around the Swiss app to take a shortcut is to say like, well, people care about what that app does, but they don't care about Facebook. Right? So that's not true. There are some people who always cared about Facebook and what Facebook did. Don't approximate like that everyone, right? So there are people who, yeah, I mean, there are people who care about this. And if you have a model where you want the technologists to be on board and use your system so that you have a large user base, well, you should think about it as well beforehand. Yes?
You said that some people were arguing in bad faith or without scientific basis, but I recall there were still arguments around papers you mentioned around the shaded areas of between below the R equal 1 curve and so on.
So you remember that there were scientific arguments about what that curve meant and how to interpret that?
I think I remember that these arguments were used by the proponents of various contact tracing apps. So they were referring to. You could
right.
argue that they're not referring.
So okay, I'll make more precise what I meant. So you're saying there were arguments around the utility of those apps based on those graphs back then. It's true. You will see later that I think that those arguments were simplistic. The papers were essentially misunderstood. I'll go into that much later. But what I'm trying to say here at this stage is that some teams, especially from the UK, were saying the decentralized model cannot work because it's not collecting enough information. It doesn't make enough information flow around. It's trying to do too little, just notifying people. And there are epidemiological reasons why more information should circulate. And this information might be a privacy risk, but if you don't do that, then it's useless, right? And part of those arguments have been validated, I think, and I'll get into that. So some, but very, very few, were trying to have a scientific debate about what information should circulate for epidemiological reasons. And that debate was constantly derailed on security and on privacy arguments, which is, I mean, at the time, many people knew it was wrong, but in hindsight, it's totally wrong. So this change in April 10th meant a second change on April 20, an update from the Botnar Foundation. So this money that was going into PEPP through EPFL actually started going into DP3T, or the decentralized model through EPFL again. So there is this update in the middle on April 20th. So with 3.5 million of francs to go directly into DP3T. And the result is SwissCovid and many other apps around the world now that are following this decentralized model. Okay. So I want to basically go through the problems with these apps, the problems that were ignored or overlooked or tolerated, however you want to phrase it, throughout the past few months. So the first problem that I'll highlight is that there is a security privacy problem. All the information, almost everything circulates in the clear, right? So between phones, the identifiers are not encrypted. You hear a lot this being said, that this is encrypted. Whenever you hear that, it means the person talking doesn't know what they are talking about, either that, or they are trying to confuse people who know less than them. Saying that something is encrypted increases trust in a system. This is not it. This is not encrypted. It also has legal consequences. If you have identifiers circulating, this is, from a legal perspective, just pseudonymous data, which is still personal data in Europe. And if that data is encrypted, it's easier to just overlook that aspect. So this is when it circulates between phones, but also later on, this is the bottom left, when phones go and fetch from the server, right, the data. I can give you the URL for the Swiss server, for the Danish server, for the Belgian server, for the Italian one, where you can go and download the keys for the day and the keys from the previous days. Anyone can go, and what you get was the keys that were initially secret, but are no longer secret because that infected person uploaded their key. It's a voluntary act, but it should be explained to them what that means, right? That means essentially that all their identifiers that they've been broadcasting and that were unlinkable, as long as they didn't upload their key, they're now suddenly linkable. So they've had the same identifier for the past X days, just broadcasted around. And this allows for all kinds of attacks, including re-identification attacks. So that's the image at the bottom right that's supposed to give this idea that suddenly if you have a passive network of sensors, then you can know that there is someone here that was then there, that was then there, that was then there. You can trace the movements of people, which is a first step to trying to re-identify them. Okay, so there are re-identification attacks that exist. They just exist. Now it's a question of how easy they are, who is motivated to do them, etc., etc. We'll get into that in a second. There are also relaying attacks. All the information circulates unencrypted, unauthenticated. Sorry, let me requalify this. All information circulates without authentication. Almost all of it circulates not encrypted. Okay, so there's just a tiny bit of metadata that is encrypted, so I need to be very precise. But the identifiers are not encrypted. So that means you can do relaying attacks. I can go to the hospital in Geneva, listen to beacons that circulate, and I can replay them here in the room and start painting everyone who has SwissCovid installed with beacons that are very likely to test positive very quickly. And that would mean that my victims get a notification that didn't have sense to get, okay? So you could have a student, this is described in the original papers, nothing original there. Many people know this. You could have a student that just, for fun, starts making notifications go to their professor's phone, for instance. Wouldn't be hard. You can also do tampering. You can modify the signals to cheat with the distance perception. Yes.
One addition is like you cannot publish your key alone.
You cannot publish your keys alone
On the server.
Yes. So there is a in the Swiss model, but not in other countries. I think there are some countries that are without this restriction. It's still left up to the national authority to decide who can upload keys. Okay, so it's still left to the national authority to put a gate to gatekeep. And in Switzerland, you need basically a positive test. And you need a positive test calling the hotline, which sends you to another hotline that gives you eventually a code that you can enter and allows you to upload.
I think going your argument that the system is centralized, not only technically at the end, but also in the administration of it.
Yes, so in the administration of it, there is a lot of centralization in getting the permission to upload, which is a problem for communities where the healthcare system is deficient, which is up to people to decide in Switzerland whether that's the case or not. But that perception might change very quickly, right? I mean, we are seeing the numbers, we're seeing how much the contact tracing teams are being overwhelmed. So that perception might evolve very fast. So that's a centralized decision body. Another one is, of course, Google and Apple that decide how things can evolve. Even the European Union, in a sense, because now there is a question of interoperability, how the keys are allowed to circulate between different countries. And Europe is deciding that Switzerland can't play in that system. So if you have your keys in Switzerland, they don't travel to Germany or something, or Italy. So that's also a lot of decision power that's centralized.
Are you going to come back on this specific issue of Europe and Switzerland?
No.
Okay, just one question.
Yes.
Do you have anything to do with the European CDC, ECDC, Center for Disease Control? And the European, it's the EU health agency.
So the question is, why is there a problem between Switzerland and the rest of Europe for interoperability of the keys? So it's not a technical problem. It is a legal problem. I don't know how much is due to Europe, how much is due to Switzerland. The health systems there are not enough agreements between the health systems to share data. It is possible that Europe is playing a nasty game of leveraging the position to get Switzerland to agree to more. But it's very hard to get information about that, unbiased information, because you only have Switzerland's viewpoint, essentially. The rest of Europe doesn't really care that the Swiss keys don't exchange well. Now, I mentioned that all those attacks, there was big questions around the feasibility, right? And I gave an example where you needed to have a network of sensors that were deployed. So this is the unrealistic scenario where you start paying for a lot of hardware to be deployed everywhere so you can spy on the population. But one argument you can have, and this is detailed in 2 papers with Joel Reardon, is that actually this hardware of sensors is already deployed. It's everyone else's smartphone, essentially, right? So on my smartphone, I have apps that are paid for by advertising and that I know vaguely collect a ton of data that they hear, including Bluetooth data, including geolocation data. And this all goes to the advertising technology ecosystem, which is really all over the place, right? So it could be an American company, it could be a Chinese company, it could be a Brazilian company, you have no idea. Let me give you an example. If you install Blick, the app for Blick, the newspaper in the German part of Switzerland, it has in Locomedia, this Brazilian SDK, so software development kit that is integrated with the app and that will collect Wi-Fi data. And in Loco is installed on a ton of apps. Some of them collect Bluetooth data as well. So in Loco is centralizing a lot of information from Bluetooth, from Wi-Fi, that essentially could very easily replicate this attack. It's just a question of software at this stage. They've positioned everywhere. It's just a few lines of code and they could start running this attack, which was part of my argument in that paper on the assessment of risk by the health authorities, because they were saying, well, to conduct the attack, you need to be in Switzerland, so you're subject to Swiss laws. The reality is, no, this attack can be done remotely using millions of phones that are deployed, and we don't know about exactly what channels could be used, but there are vulnerabilities everywhere in that ecosystem, especially if you deploy a protocol that broadcasts everything in the clear. Now, Bluetooth has a lot of questions also around ranging, right? One of the core assumptions is that you can measure distance with Bluetooth. The inventor of Bluetooth says there is no chance, essentially, of doing that. And I have a link here at the bottom to a video or to a big text that includes that video. And I really invite you to watch it, because once you've done that, you're like, why are we even trying? So the video is one guy who has his phone broadcasting Bluetooth signals. It's in his front pocket. And you can see the attenuation of the signal here. So there is some level that is fairly constant. And from there, some distance is inferred, right? So let's not even care whether this is correct or not. Let's just compare with a different situation. So he takes his phone and he puts it in his back pocket. Oh, and I should have said the sensor is near the camera. So 1.5 meters away in front of him, right? So just from doing this, and for those who are online, I'm taking the phone from my front pocket to my back pocket. The attenuation, there's a lot more attenuation. The signal is not as strong. And from there, a higher distance is inferred, right? And it's not just the 10 centimeters of the thickness of his body. It goes from, this line is 2 meters, it goes to 12. Okay, and it's a multiplicative factor, right? It's not an additive factor. So if there is a little bit of water, because Bluetooth beacons are, Bluetooth advertising channels are very sensitive to water. If there is water in between, and bodies are made of water, essentially, then it attenuates the signal a lot. So when you try to infer distance, you get completely wild measurements. So you could have two people who are like just next to each other, but phones in the back pocket, no chance that that signal would be picked up, essentially. Or if it gets picked up, the distance is like 50 meters. And we can have other doubts about the utility of Bluetooth for distance. For instance, here, this is the studies that were done by EPFL to calibrate the phone in order to infer distance on trains. Right, so their simulation was to put some chairs. This picture is taken from above in a hallway, and you have like some chairs, people facing each other, and this is supposed to measure the distance in a train and to look at how well the signals are propagating. Now, this is problematic because there are also studies that show that in a train, the signal is not monotone, meaning you can be further away and the signal is stronger, right? Because it's a metal enclosure, so the signals bounce around and you can have lensing effects that make it, or multiple paths that make it arrive basically stronger than it should. Okay, and this is the type of calibration that was done where basically it's an open room. It's completely different. It's wooden chairs. I mean, it's not the same. But it does give the appearance that this app is very scientifically built. Other problems with the app are that there's a complete lock-in, of course, of Google and Apple. The people who developed it are presumably under non-disclosure agreements. And this agreement with Google and Apple limits what we can do, limits how we can use this data that is being collected to usefully fight the epidemic. Another problem is that the counterfactuals are wrong. So what do I mean by that? Remember this graph, this scenario and the picture of the utility? So in the scenario, two things were happening. The first thing that was happening is that when the person had a symptom, they would isolate directly. They would not go out. They would just wait for a test. And the second thing that would happen is that the test would test positive, of course, and then they would signal to others. right? When this measured the efficacy, it looked at both combined, at both effects combined. Now, you can do a much more precise analysis that tries to assess which action actually is useful between the two, right? So you can try to really decompose the utility of the notification from the utility of the other measures. And it's in this paper, a mathematical assessment of the efficiency of quarantining and contact tracing in curbing the COVID-19 epidemic. So quarantine and contact tracing. What this tries to do is decouple the two, right? And it looks at all the other interventions like self-quarantine upon symptoms. And then what does contact tracing actually add to that, right? And essentially it gives exact formulas for this picture on the right, but with a much more granular decomposition of the utility of different interventions, the different interventions on the left, okay? And you get those graphs, which are really like indicative of the actual pattern. So on the x-axis, you have R, the reproductive number. And so he asks the question, what does it take to get R below 1 when with all the other intervention, R is at a certain value, right? So if R is at 1.5, what is the proportion of the population that needs to install the app in order for us to be able to bring it below 1? Okay, and that's just the advantage of the app. And the result is that it's huge, essentially. And very importantly, it grows very, very quickly. Okay, so it grows very quickly, meaning if you are around 1.05 and you want to bring it below 1, you already have to have more people installing the app than we are currently, than the level we're at currently, which is 18%. So you can only hope to reduce R by maybe 0.05 from an app. Now, this is maybe a bit counterintuitive compared to this graph, but actually he explains in the paper already in May, people are reading this wrong, this paper wrong. Why? Because they're assuming that upon symptoms, people are isolating directly themselves. What they've missed is that those people might not be infected, but if they are, the moment they have symptoms, they'll isolate as well, right? That's the policy. So you're attributing a benefit to the app that is very limited. It's just in this interval of time before symptoms and after notification that there is an advantage, right? So he's decomposing that advantage from the rest, and it shows that graph. Now this 0.05, it's very hard to estimate, like what does that mean, right? How good is it? Remember, there's a lot of unrealistic assumptions there. Is that the Bluetooth captures everything, it's instantaneous. I mean, there's a lot of assumptions. Well, there is this other paper that can give quite a good perspective. So the title on the left is How Policies on Restaurants, Bars, Nightclubs, Masks, Schools, and Travel Influence Swiss COVID-19 Reproduction Ratios. So what they did in this paper, which is very interesting, they look at the 26 cantons for the past, I think it was 26 weeks, coincidentally, right, back until March, and they looked at all the different measures and how the reproductive number changed canton per canton. So they have this big matrix of reproductive number on a given week and interventions. And they try to decompose the effect of each of the different interventions. All right, so some cantons resisted for a long time imposing masks in public transit, for instance, right? But the moment they did, there was a little change in their reproductive number, combined with other changes due to other measures. And what those guys are doing is trying to untangle everything. And so you should look at the slides afterwards if you care really, but the picture on the bottom right is very interesting. So what it shows is the difference in R here between before lockdown and different level of measures for closures of restaurants, bars, and nightclubs. Okay, So before the lockdown and the slightest of measures on restaurants, including social distancing and everything, this leads to a difference in 0.6 in the reproductive number. But that's huge, right? The bars are still open with respect to social distancing versus just normal life before COVID. Difference of 0.6. Okay? But then you can be stronger. You can close all the way, or you can have some intermediate measure, and you see that the gain is very, very tiny. Yes?
How it's possible when you close it all the way that it's not like on the axis?
Sorry?
It's not at 0, 0, when it's like totally closed.
I'm not entirely sure why, but it's a relative measure.
Yeah, okay.
Good question, but I'm not entirely sure why. Then there is the bars where you see the same effect, and the nightclubs is a different effect, actually. The nightclubs, you see that with the social distancing, after the lockdown, with the social distancing, but the clubs of up to 100 people open, so it's over here. Open with an audience of over 100 up to 300. It's over here. There's a very tiny dent, right? So people don't respect social distancing measures in clubs. But if you close them, then the effect is very big. This is a minus 0.10 all the way to above 0.05. So essentially 0.17, right? So remember, we're trying to understand comparatively to the app, what is the benefit. So the app, the bound was around 0.05. And this is essentially saying that the advantage is at best a third of club closure. Yes?
I'm not very sure. Like, it calculates the effect of the infection in the bar or in total?
In total. So we can contest the numbers. I mean, it's not perfect, but if you think about it this way, I think this frame is good for thinking about it. And it gives numbers that are plausible and fairly consistent in the measures. Yes.
Because I'm surprised that so many people go to the night.
That so many people go to the nightclubs.
Yeah.
Well, I think we'll get into that actually. You maybe don't need that many, but you just need the setting to be such that. Right. So another critical aspect of the apps is that it's anchored, the way the apps are built is anchored in our understanding from March and April of how the epidemic works. Yes?
In Western understanding.
Yes, in Western understanding. Thank you. In Western understanding, because these apps were informed a lot by what was done in the East, or at least they thought it was. And we took our own version of it, which actually doesn't replicate what they do at all. The situation has evolved. It has evolved in our understanding that aerosols might be more important than droplets, or might be equally important. They are important as well, among other things. And more importantly, or importantly as well, overdispersion. I say our understanding has evolved since March, April, but actually since January, some people have been saying, watch out for this. This is an important effect. So the reference for really understanding this is this article in The Atlantic, which it's a long article, but I very highly recommend reading it. It's not so technical. It's not about apps really, but it's about how COVID propagates. Let me try to explain very quickly. So you're working in computer science or connected domains. This is what people think about R. This is a graph with an R of 2. Every node generates 2 nodes, right? 2 infections. In reality, for COVID, R is on average around 2.5. So 10 people will infect 25, something like that, okay? But when you think about that, immediately you're drawn to this type of graph, very regular, right? Maybe some people infect 2, some people infect 3, and on average it gives 2.5. The reality is very different. This is more like the reality. So this is an illustration from the article in The Atlantic that I mentioned before. Well, an illustration of, it wasn't in the article. Some people thought the article was so useful that they decided to illustrate it because they thought they could make the point even stronger. 10% of the coronavirus cases cause 80% of transmissions. 70% of cases infect no one, right? And then once in a while, there's one case that infects 8 others. This is what sustains the epidemic, is those exceptional, or you can ask to what extent they are exceptional, since this is what's driving the epidemic, but it's those cases that drive. Yes?
And how can we be sure about that?
How can we know this,
Yeah.
this information? It's okay, so the fact that, for instance, 70% of people infect no one is derived from 2 studies, one in Hong Kong and one in India, where I think in India they had 500,000 people's contact networks, and out of like 50,000 people who were infected, they traced all the network of contacts. They did this extremely carefully. They have quite a high confidence that they have everyone, because at some point when you have so many people, you start having the whole graph. There is no infection left to explain because you have found all the infections, right? And so they have extensive information about this, about the contact patterns that they can measure. And then, of course, there is some statistics and some level of inference, but it's pretty rock solid. I mean, they have an extensive amount of information.
Location data?
No, it's tracing, it's people asking questions. Who were you in contact with?
500,000?
Yes.
I mean, even with strangers in the bus or in the...
Well, they will not catch everything, but they will catch enough to have confidence to establish that, right? So most of those infections here are actually in the home, in the house, at work. So you can trace that, right? So in the Atlantic paper, that paragraph where she explains this, where she says 70% and so on, that paragraph has like 6 or 7 links to scientific papers, right? So the evidence is starting to become very solid of this. The Indian study is new on top of that Atlantic article, right? So this iterates. Here it's 8 out of 10 or 7 out of 10 that infect no one, then 1 that starts like really spreading it, and then that one out of those to the next generation spread again a lot, right? And the R0 in her example is indeed 1.2 because you get 12 infections out of 10. So the numbers add up, but it's far from just being everyone infects 1. Now, this overdispersion, this is called overdispersion, the fact that there is a huge variability in the number of secondary cases from the number of index cases, leads to a lot of stochasticity, so a lot of randomness. Who will be the super spreader, the seeder for the next generation? We don't really know, but it's going to be one among those people, right? And this leads to a lot of randomness in the way the epidemic propagates, because it could be that that person is in the household of the initial case, or is someone that was sitting next to them in the subway, and that leads to very different propagation patterns. Yes?
Do we know if it's event related or is the person?
Right, we'll get to that. So the point of that paper is to say, watch out, again, back in May, watch out, there's a lot more dispersion than people think. There's a lot more stochasticity. All of the predictive modeling is highly, highly dependent on those things. So you will get to predict all kinds of different things about the number of infected people, the amount of time until a second wave arrives. All of those things are highly, highly random. Okay, so now that I've trashed the apps, what can we do? Well, think back about the contact graph, right? So this is a true picture. Well, not quite, because there is this dispersion that is not quite present, right? One person will infect many others, then some will infect no one. We only have a partial view. That's the idea of those blue ones that we don't know. one idea that was presented was contact tracing, digital contact tracing with this app. But it's only one way of doing contact tracing, forward contact tracing. There are other ways. Well, there is backward contact tracing as well. What's the idea? Well, in forward contact tracing, you have two index cases, index case 1, index case 2, and those two guys will infect others, right? And from there, you start asking questions and try to find. And the green ones are those you've found and you can put in quarantine. And in yellow are those you don't find. And this is a situation when you have two index cases. But if you're doing something on top, if you're doing backward tracing as well, you can hope from those two who are infected to find the primary case, who infected them both, right? So if Maurizio and Simon in 5 days start coughing, test positive, there is a very high chance that it's someone in this room that infected them both. Okay, so that's the idea. Because that person was in this room, there are others in the room that might be infected as well. Yes?
High chance come from the variability too.
From what we have measured. Yeah. We don't exactly know why this is true, but we have measured that. Right? So we don't have perfect information. I'll get into that in a second. Right? So in practice, this is a little extension of the graph before. What does that mean? Well, instead of asking a question like forward tracing, who have you been in contact with since your infection? Right? So that's where the question mark is, the end of the arrow, with 70% chance that that person would anyway not infect anyone. Then you go back. You ask, where do you think you might have been infected? Right? And maybe Maurizio is super careful, doesn't go out a lot, and he's like, well, I've only participated in this event and that event. And Simon, who starts coughing, same thing. Well, actually, I did this. He went to a lot more events, but he knows exactly which. And from there, we start recouping that, oh, actually, that event might have had more than one person. Right? So if you go back, if you think about this like this, if you have multiple people and you try to go back, well, there's essentially a lot of arrows that point to the source. A lot more chance of finding the source. Right? And that's what we're trying to exploit. This, again, was known for a long time. It was known since May. There's a paper on the effectiveness of backward contact. Well, actually, backward contact tracing is a classic technique. But this paper really explores the utility in the context of COVID and in the context of contact tracing apps. So in May, they came out with a paper that started commenting on the protocols of contact tracing apps, contacted them saying, well, actually, you could make your point sharper. So in September, they put out a new version where it says current implementation of digital contact tracing, including the Apple and Google partnership and the DP-PT proposal, notify the contacts of an infected individual about the risk of infection. However, they neglect that one of the previous contacts is likely the source of infection who might be infecting others. We show that multiple notifications are particularly indicative of the parents. So if you have multiple notifications, then the parent is like, oh, wait, why am I getting multiple notifications? I might have infected many people, actually. Right?
Just make a remark.
Sorry?
Let's just say,
yes?
It's a question also. If these people are writing this paper in May,
yeah,
specifically mentioning backward contact tracing,
yes,
because there have been many papers, reports about contact tracing before, but they didn't necessarily specifically mention backward contact tracing. It was
there were some papers on backward contact tracing, but
I mean in the context of the pandemic.
Yes.
For instance, if it was being done in Japan or Korea, they didn't write back. We're doing backward contact. They just said we're doing contact tracing, and we found the origin of the infection.
No, so sometimes information is surprisingly slow to travel around the world.
No, but what I mean,
right?
So it was there, but it was not explicit. And my question is, are they making it explicit because they're trying to push for this method?
Well, here, yeah, they are trying to explicitly say the protocols are being designed wrong, and so yes, they were trying to point that there was a problem. I'm trying to say there were warning signs that were ignored. Right? And if I need to speculate, I would say that Sorry? So
Is that the right university?
you said it, not me.
I say.
Okay, it's not the right universities. The other papers were Oxford, Cambridge, and so on. These are much smaller universities. It's also tied with the scientific field. So you see that the methods here are much more mathematical. They're much less about computer simulations. The computer simulations come from Oxford, Cambridge, much more recognized institutions, and those are different things. So I tried to say it earlier. So what those guys are trying to do is they're trying to compute exactly the dynamic. It's like they're trying to have a closed form for a derivative, right? What happens instantaneously. And they're trying to do the exact mathematical calculation, the modeling that gives them a formula where you can disagree on the parameters, but you can just plug it into the formula. While the other guys are trying to compute an integral based on some very dynamic system, and they run computer simulations for that, right? So they simulate again and again. They know that it's not that stochastic when they look at the average, because they always get more or less the same result from the assumptions they have. And they, like if they introduce randomness, it will not, in precise places, it will not affect the end result, but they don't have closed forms for those calculations. They don't have a deep understanding of what the dynamics are, which points to another problem, which is that when there is public communication around those predictive models, people misinterpret them, right? Because do you see those graphs that say there will be 1 million deaf people, and no one is really equipped to understand what that simulation actually means. It's not that useful, actually. Don't know if I explained this well, but.
So they make a model, they write a mathematical model by hand.
Yes.
And the other.
They run a simulation. They run a simulation. This model is much better for sharing knowledge and understanding deeper, because they have clear assumptions. And if you disagree with some parameters, or if you want to apply it in your own locale where the dynamics might be different, you plug it a different value in there, right? In that closed formula. The formula is complex, but you plug in a different value and there you go. Well, with the simulation thing, you have to run your own supercomputer, right? So it shows that there is really a problem in understanding between the two. There's one is much more potent understanding, if you want. And it's really, it seems from the outside, it seems like there is some kind of fracture in the digital epidemiology, mathematical epidemiology, whatever you want to call it, in between two groups, two approaches. So maybe the best known person in there is in that field is called Joel Miller. He wrote a big book on mathematics of epidemics and so on. He's not an author here, but he has author of a lot of other papers that are connected. And he's in a small university. I don't know him, I don't know his circumstances, but I can observe that he's in a small university in Australia, but he's a reference in that subfield of epidemiology. I don't know why. Now, what can we do, right? And I should close soon. So, well, we're gonna have to trace contacts. So we better do it well. That's my thinking. So here is a graph of some slightly modified real data from Canton Geneva that shows interaction contact networks, basically, for people in Geneva. So in brown, those nodes are people. The small ones are infected people. The big ones are, we don't know. There are people who are sitting in quarantine, but we don't know if they're infected or not because we're not testing them at the moment, right? If you go in quarantine because you were in contact with someone that was infected, your perspective is just either you wait for 10 days without symptoms, or the moment you have symptoms, you test to see if you're positive or not, right? So I think this is a mistake because that person might be asymptomatic and have spread in the past. So if we test them, we'll learn something. It will not change their circumstance because they will remain in quarantine, even if they test negative, because there's a lot of false negatives, right? But we would learn more about who else they might have infected. This is the best place to act to actually prevent infections from asymptomatic people. Right? So this is a network, and with two brown nodes are connected by context where they were in contact. So pink means social, blue like this means, light blue means uncategorized, greenish means professional context. And the small blue like this, the very small blue nodes means home, same home, people who live at the same place, right? And so you start building this network, which hopefully, if it's like in India and Hong Kong, starts being one big giant graph with just one connected component, because you can trace exactly who is in contact with whom, and you can trace exactly how the disease propagated, right? What you don't want here is lots of small little islands where you don't know where it comes from. All right. So if you start to do, yeah.
You have 2 arrows in one brown.
So, sorry, again?
You have 2 arrows arriving in one brown.
In one brown.
One person. There is like
here?
The one in the yes or the one.
Yeah, so this is an example. So this, for those who are watching online, in the top right, there is one node that is a big node, brown node, surrounded by 3 small contacts in 3 different colors. The green means that it's a professional contact, the pink means it's a social contact, and the blue is uncategorized. But it's in that person, and this was from 6 weeks ago, this is data from 6 weeks ago. That person was had 3 different reasons to be in quarantine. 3 reasons because they were 3 times in contact with an infected person, and different because it was in different contexts. So there is a very high suspicion that that person is actually an pre-symptomatic, and is pre-symptomatic and has maybe infected others, right? So this is, in the previous picture, you have to think 3 nodes, we're going back up and we found the person. That's an hypothesis, but the chances are much higher. That person should definitely be tested. Okay. Now you can also do the same thing, and we get to your questions, with venues, with events. And this is what this big node here circled in black is. This is an event where people attended, right? And at least 1 person was infected, and actually in this case there were 2. Well, sorry, 2 infected people were at that event. Now, is there a causal link? We don't know, but we have to do a lot of maths to estimate when we can be pretty certain that there was a propagation event. And it's pretty obvious that it will get harder and harder to infer things as the epidemic spreads, right? If there is more and more spreading, then you get a lot of signals, and it's harder to know exactly which ones are important or not, or meaningful or not. They might just be coincidences, right? That 2 people went to the same party and were already infected from different sources. So this venue tracing is now arriving in Geneva with the app Koga, in Canton Vaud with the app Social Pass, right? When you go to a restaurant or when you go to a social event, you have to register with a QR code. These functionalities have been in apps in Asia for over 6 months, but they're only now arriving in Europe at the very last minute, implemented very, very last minute in some cantons. In Geneva, they have it since July, with an audit and all of that. So there are 3 different effects here that might be confusing, and 5 more minutes, and then. So there are 3 effects here that might be confusing if you want to do backward contact tracing. Well, if you want to do contact tracing well, and there's 3 effects are arriving at the same time in the discussion. So it can be very, very confusing. The first is aerosols are important as well, not just droplets, right? So it's hard to imagine someone would start spitting on everyone around and be a super spreader through droplets. There's probably some link between like spreading to a lot of people and aerosols, right? That some room starts filling with virus in the air because there's poor air circulation, and then a lot of people go through that room and get infected that way. So there is also the discussion around forward and backward contact tracing. It's hard sometimes to know exactly whether when you follow a contact event, whether you're going back or forward in time for the infection. Like you might know that two people who were infected met at a certain point, but you don't necessarily know who infected whom because of the timing of the virus. And then there is overdispersion, this fact that suddenly there's a lot of, some people infect many others, right? And that means going for cluster busting rather than breaking infection chains. Those are two empty words or empty concepts essentially, but you want to do more of the first than the latter. And when I say cluster busting, I'm not talking about whether it's an event or whether it's a person. In both cases, it's a cluster. Right? So it's very confusing and difficult. It's hard to detect like which is, whether we're targeting people or whether we're targeting events to do the backward contact tracing. We're probably doing a bit of both. We don't exactly know which mode of transmission corresponds to what. But in a sense, it doesn't necessarily matter all that much if we're smart about the data we get and to utilize it the most optimally, right? But some experts on the scientific task force recommend that short term, given the situation, the best effort we can do is to bust clusters by busting events, finding the events where the propagation occurs. And of course, we should learn as much as we can, as quickly as we can from this, especially given that the circumstances are changing. So we should anticipate how the effect of changing circumstances like the weather on the propagation. Right, so this was, again, the cluster. All right, and now I conclude. So my conclusion is that around all these apps, we essentially rushed everywhere. Of course, there was a crisis, there is a crisis, there was a need to act quickly, but we did rush. Partly we misread the studies that were published, or we ignored those that were questioning how we were reading the published studies. We wanted this to work, essentially. Engineers at some point took over with the wrong epidemiological specs, and they didn't leave any space for correcting those specs because it becomes a cemented system, a cemented digital system. That's it, that's what we have. And well, it's not quite what we need, but it's what we have. And essentially, a big plug for my old profession, listen to mathematicians as well. Because a lot of mathematicians have sounded the alarm about this, about saying that we were interpreting the models wrong and that we should be very careful. From my perspective, it was very reminiscent of what happened with the 2008 financial crisis, where black swans, like those exceptional events, were actually super important and were ignored in all the models and had big consequences. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul-Olivier. So we have time for a discussion now, maybe any questions. Who would like to give it a shot? If you're online within the selected topics, just unmute your mic and you can speak up. Otherwise, use the hashtag, which is FacLab COVID on Twitter. We're looking at that too.
And there seems to be quite a bit of delay between Twitter and
apparently,
us,
yes.
But not if you post. Not yet. Yes, please.
Do we know how much theory there was when various countries, which is always the same, we know Japan, Korea, I don't know about China. How much, do we know how much theory of this theory they developed in February? Because they started going after clusters and going backward tracing in February.
So I don't remember the numbers, but there was a lot of experience in Asia, right? So they had previous epidemics and they were like, we need to do contact tracing. There's some people who have done, I should say backward contact tracing is not new. It was applicable for SARS-CoV-1, which was also overdispersed for Ebola as well. But what they did is they put a lot of staff, like huge numbers. so that was maybe the, not technology, just people. It was also different timing. We had a little bit more time to see it coming, to the extent that, as I said, in March, there were some papers that started to be published. In April, May, there were papers that were started to be published saying, we're actually reading this wrong, right? So there was some theory in Europe quickly. The information that came from Asia was mostly data about their own cases. So the first graph I showed with the proportion of pre-symptomatic infections, for instance, this is derived from data from Asia.
The reason I asked this question is, from my perspective, the reason we're here, we're talking about this, is not because it's interesting. It is interesting. Scientific.
Thank you.
But it's because, sorry, but it's because scientific, but it's because it's a problem. We're trying to solve a problem, practical problem, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the main reason you're giving this talk. You're not trying to write more papers to get published. I assume.
Yeah. Well, I care about. I'll tell you what I care about. So I care, of course, that the epidemic is solved. Yes, but I also care about avoiding mistakes with technology being pushed too fast,
Okay.
and creating secondary effects that we don't anticipate. And that was maybe my mistake over the past few months, is to focus on that secondary effect rather than the primary effect. I was assuming that others were looking at the primary effects in detail, and I was trying to anticipate, okay, what happens if we start to do contact tracing that exploits biases in society to target quickly the source of infection, right? What kind of disparate impact can it have on different people?
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking 2 steps ahead. Well, maybe I should have just looked at the first step ahead. I'm sure those questions will still be relevant. If the strategy changes here, and this is important, this is an important message actually now. If the strategy changes here and becomes much more, okay, we detect events. This is what we have limited staff, we have limited capabilities. If we detect that 2 people were at the same event and we think this is statistically significant, then we don't take any precautions and we quarantine everyone who was at the event. Well, this will not have the same impact on everyone, right? Some people have to go to work, some people have to work at events, they will be quarantined much more quickly. So we need to be able to think about that. And we've barely had this conversation around the app and false notifications and all of that. But if we start having a much more broader strategy, it will have a real impact.
Why, I mean, I understand.
And this, sorry, if I can add.
Sorry.
This is actually one of the big steps that we'll have to do, I suspect. Right now, what happens is that if you are quarantined, there is a network of support that comes financially, among other things. Like if you can't work, then you get 80% of your salary is paid by the state, etc. And if you can't work because your activity is being shut down, like the nightclubs, then the state comes and provides financial help, right? But what if we get to like some combination of both, where we start quarantining people in some specific activities much more, because that activity is at much more risk? Like, how do we compensate as a society for these people's supporting more of the burden of the epidemic, right? So it's, in a sense, it's a risk, because it becomes a much more scientific driven decision away from politics, maybe, which might be better. But in another sense, it's an opportunity, because we base ourselves on facts and on as much evidence as we can, which might help us find more quickly a consensus towards the right, better solution, a more democratic solution. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand the interesting points. That last one, that if you have a good justification, more objective, it's much easier to explain things and people are down.
Well, I think if you have a reason why you're doing things and you're capable of explaining it, or why you want to do something, then the debate around whether it should be done or not is much better. Doesn't mean it will be done, but it means that more arguments the debate is more productive in general.
understand, but if you want to sign like a scientific understanding with papers, it takes time. You said we had papers early and it was quick. It was true, it's quick. You said March, April, May in Europe, but March is too late. I mean, we know everything. Everyone knows what happened.
I don't think so. I think we spend the summer doing almost nothing. We
No,
spend
no,
the
I
summer
understand.
watching
That's true.
TikTok videos that we should install Swiss COVID.
No, what
I
I'm saying
mean-
is March is already too late because we already closed everything down. We didn't have
Right,
to
but
close
the first lockdown was different. But now there's going to be likely a second one or close to it. And well, we could have, I don't feel like we're very well prepared.
No, that's true. I'm trying to look like further on. Why did we have a first lockdown, and why did some countries not? I mean, why did Asia have the solution, and how can we be more like these Asian countries?
Well, the Asia had more experience. They had SARS-CoV-1.
I think they have
So
also,
to the question, the real question, I think, is, this is, I haven't dig deeper, but in 2005, I happened to be in Toronto. And 2005, it was, or maybe a bit earlier, was SARS-CoV-1, right? And Toronto was the city in the Western world that was infected by SARS. Like there was no one around in the streets of Chinatown, no one. And you couldn't go to the hospital because this was where like complete lockdown. And I know because I had a tooth infection, so I needed to go to the hospital, right? So, but I'm very curious whether in Toronto things were different than in other countries or than in other regions. If that experience from the Western world of SARS-CoV-1 changed how they reacted, right? Because otherwise we're all fresh in this. And I'm just not just talking about the authorities. I'm talking about the population and understanding of the dynamic, because the city was shut down for a while. So people understood the consequences of this situation. And this is new for all of us, almost all of us. Right? And all the measures need to have buy-in from the population.
if the current measures are not working extremely well, I mean, it could be worse, much worse, but it could be much better. So instead of, I mean, it takes time to understand, just justify. A better solution, I think, would be to copy what works. We have the data, we know this and this works in this country, just copy. We don't know why it works, we cannot explain it, but it's, I mean, it's the result that matters first and foremost, and then maybe we can explain. But it's better to,
But even with,
you need to survive and then you can talk.
right,
and
so
understand why you
your
survive.
argument is we should copy without necessarily knowing why. We should
Yes.
copy what seems to work.
Because it's pure, we know the superior solution.
Well, I mean, the people who were building these apps thought they were copying something that worked, right? So that's one argument. And the other one is the masks. Look at how long it took for us to wear masks. There was so much cultural resistance to wearing masks. Maybe some hint or tint of racism even.
I think
Like the masks are for Asian people, not for us, right? That was for a while, like in the background, at least I felt like it was. People were making false excuses not to wear masks. I have glasses, bothers me a lot to have a mask, but I still wear them, right? So it took us a long time, despite it seemed like it worked, but there was no way masks would be mandated back in March, I feel. It's just too foreign.
Of course, you didn't have the masks.
We didn't have them either. So that's the other political element. We didn't have them either. We should have had them. It was in all the planning and we didn't have them. And then there was a whole miscommunication around that. Why? That's a separate question.
That's governance failure. That's not about academia or whatever.
No, that's governance failure, yes.
But,
I'm
and
relaying
I
the
think-
words.
I think where we disagree, right? I think, of course, you want people to be, self-govern or little and things, but then the responsibility is on the government to put a new norm about the mask, first of all. To say, okay, now it's not, and it's what they did at the end, and everybody would wear them, right?
Right. Once it became mandatory, everyone wore them, and it was actually quite, I mean, it was almost people were happy that it was mandatory because it removed the stigma, or it's just, I do it because I have to. Don't ask me questions and I expect you to do the same.
Yeah, and so for me, that's where it's not about the, I agree with Switzerland here is like, okay, you see there is a thing that works. So the government should say, okay, we are going to do that. It's about leadership and taking responsibility. And not saying like, you know, it's about are you washing your hands correctly? You know, of course, it's also important to do those kind of things. But if it becomes an excuse for your failure of the big picture governance, there you have a big problem, I think, in Europe and the rest.
Well, there have been failures everywhere. Like I don't have a conclusion there. But
the feeling is even if you look now at the Swiss government and say, yeah, it's not going so well, so people should wash their hands better, you know. See, the feeling is like you don't take responsibility. Like the government don't take responsibility.
What do you think would be different if this was being more publicized? What's at the bottom right? This huge gap between pre-measures and post measures. You know, the gap between the rightmost column, which is before the lockdown, and the one just on the left, which is after, with very little intervention. I think this is extremely significant. Like the first one is a jump of 0.6. The second one 0.4, and the third one is 0.17.
Okay, I agree with that, but look at New Zealand.
Yeah.
New Zealand, the government say we are going to act strongly and fast.
Yeah,
that's leadership.
Okay, so this is completely different. This is completely different. The New Zealand is an island or two.
Yes.
No, not sure. It's hugely significant. It means that you have a unit to solve this problem, and it's a clear unit. Here we know, I mean, if you understand a little bit of the dynamics, we know that the most important person to decide on the future of Geneva and the epidemic is Macron. That's it. That's it. That's just a fact. We're never going to close the border. We're dependent on them, and there is infections constantly coming everywhere. If you look at New Zealand, just fighting one, they had a second, like they thought they had one, and then it came back again, right? And the amount of effort they did to contain it then was huge. So we can't solve this on our own. The Swiss leaders cannot solve this just as Swiss leaders. It has to be another layer.
Yeah, so the governance problem is corrupt in Europe. There is.
Yeah, there is a real government. If you want to phrase it that way, yes, but it's not just the Swiss government; it's everywhere.
Have you seen this map of Germany?
Yeah.
2 days ago, and you have all the red around, and you have Germany is white.
But it's not just that Germany is white; it's that every region in Germany is white. Exactly. So it's even, and every region outside is red. So it's like even more impressive.
There is no island in Europe.
Yes.
But there can be differences. So you can pull forward in the good direction.
Yes. But Germany has the resilience of saying, the internal resilience of saying, if you come in the country, you go in quarantine for 2 weeks. We can't do that. We have people who cross the border every day to go work at the hospital from France.
German border is closed? I mean,
there is quarantines coming from different countries. Yeah.
You can't do that. There is empty hotel. You can't do that.
Yes, but that would be a much more significant.
That's what I'm talking about. It's about governance.
Yes, but even if we start doing that, if we start saying to the French nurses, you have to stay in Switzerland, then France says, actually, we can preempt on those nurses and tell them, because they can do that, and say you have to work first in France. So there's still like negotiations going on in a context that is very uncertain.
What I'm saying is like the problem.
Yeah. Well, another way is we need to be bold as well, right? We need to look at what's happening elsewhere, and if we resist looking at Asia for whatever reason, look at what's happening in New Zealand. All the effort they have to do, even though they are already in a position where you have to be bold, otherwise it's not going to work.
Maybe a couple of other points coming to my mind. One is the role of transparency in this whole situation. What's your thought on that? I mean, good, bad, what happened, what should have happened, what could happen now, and maybe also a few words on your next challenge eventually, if
we'll see that.
if
So-
you want.
So the transparency, so I think in general, more transparency is better. More transparency that is about systems, about science, the scientific process, all those things. I think it's good. But I observed that in this context, it was weaponized, or it was used as an instrument. The Swiss COVID app is open source, and so people think it's better because it's open. No, it's much more complex than that, right? But the argument that other systems were closed source were used against them. So it's very easy to have a reflexive reaction, just a spontaneous reaction to say, if the code is not open, I can't trust it. But actually, it's much more subtle than that. And for the next challenge, well, so I make no secret, I'm going to join the contact tracing team of Geneva tomorrow to help them partly, here I want to very qualify what I say, build visualizations like this to support the contact tracers, the doctors.
Today they don't have visualization, they have like Excel sheet in that format.
So
they don't have something like that.
Well, they do, they have had for a few weeks now. Whether they use it, that I don't know. But even then, the visualization is, I mean, I pointed out to the obvious ones, right? The guy on the top right, it's pretty obvious that once you understand the dynamic, that something should be done. But as I said, this was from a few weeks ago. Now the graph is like everyone's connected to everyone. It's gonna become much harder if you suddenly have all the venues that have to tell like who was infected there. It's gonna be a big mess of a big network. It's going to be very hard to extract information from this. And that will be partly my job, to try to find like good metrics to attract attention of the actually qualified medics or doctors or epidemiologists to the right places.
So today this graph is all connected between the clusters?
This is the best connections they had 6 weeks ago.
6 weeks ago, but you're saying if we have it today, you don't have separate, I see separate clusters.
Yes.
You're saying everything is connected?
The goal would be to connect everything, because that means we can really trace the virus, right?
But it's not, everything is not necessarily, I mean, you have these different, I don't know how you call them, shapes, clusters. They're independent of each other.
Right.
Oh yeah, of course, obviously everything is connected in theory, you're right.
Yes. So, yeah. But there's limitations. If maybe between two of the clusters there was someone from Vaud, right, who propagated it. So do they get the data about it in Geneva or not? Or maybe it was someone from abroad, or maybe it was a surface. Like, there's always going to be uncertainty about, it's never going to be perfect, but it's a very good sign if the number of clusters, the number of connected components decreases. It means we're tracing more.
One more question, like for the next quizzes, right? Because we speak about experience and things, but my feeling is that we need to learn how to solve and govern things we never had.
I'll say it very, very bluntly. In Switzerland, there was a decision that those people are smart and those people are stupid. And that should not be replicated. Right? There were people who were tasked with finding a solution, and others who were tasked with waiting for the solution to arrive. And we didn't use our ingenuity that is very distributed to build solutions. Like, we had to wait for manufactured masks to come from China to essentially all wear them. We could have had a very different system where, you know, people did it for each other locally. Even if it's not perfect, it helps. This could have been encouraged more, you know, so like resilience, improve resilience like that. Instead, it was just like, wait, the task forces on it, or whatever you want to call it.
And probably shouldn't be a single country
effort to develop this? So what kind of governance?
Right. So that's the other thing. So this is in a way centralizing power to solve the problem. While if you leave people to their ingenuity, their own ingenuity, but also their capability of connecting with others elsewhere who can build other solutions, then it's much more resilient, because we just need a good solution coming out of Denmark to be replicated here, right? Or coming out for who cares where. And especially another aspect that is really important that I don't know how clear it is for you guys, but well, it's clear to everyone that an epidemic was a transformative moment for like everyone, their perception of society and all of that. But when the wave arrives, you're dealing with, oh, I have a lecture to deliver, or I have kids to take care of, or suddenly you lose your functionality in society. Like, and this is true for everyone. This is true for, the people coding the Swiss COVID app. They have to take care of their kids who are not in school anymore. This is true for the epidemiologist who is trying to write a paper. This is true for everyone, right? But in this case, the epidemic didn't arrive everywhere at the same time. It came like the sun, right? East to west, essentially. So there was a different timing there, and we could have used experience from the East early and resorted to them at some point when they were like behind the peak to help us when we were at the peak. There was a lot of underuse of experience and so on. And I think those networks could have been created much more organically than what we eventually did.
Yeah, fully agree on that, but I just don't know. Like the past 20 years, I guess my fight was like, oh, you make people able to do stuff, without permission, right?
Yeah.
And I don't have that.
Well, in this case, it was very easy to prevent people from making stuff. Right? In the digital space, especially, because Apple and Google decided whatever you do, it has to be approved by the health authority. And actually, you can only do this subset of things. So there was a very clear chain of command that obviously stopped at some point and didn't go all the way. I mean, yeah.
We have a question from Alexis Roussel. Do you think Geneva cantonal health authorities will change their strategy to adapt backward tracing?
I don't know. I think they're all doing backward tracing to some extent, right? So if they hear that, oh, there is a yodeling event, you were at a yodeling event, that was nice, and they hear it 10 times, then it's going to be hard not to realize there is a problem. So the question is how actively people look for those, how actively the authorities look for those, and how to balance between the different strategies, because this costs resources, right? And the backward tracing is very much, so this is interesting. It's very much an investment on the next week, essentially, because you're trying to trace to prevent further infections, but it's a lot of work to trace, and you might find the source, but say the source is at the FacLab. How do we find who was here, right? There's no list, we didn't maintain a list, nothing. So this becomes, it might be a lot of effort of the authorities for nothing at the end. And so as long as the population doesn't understand what is being done around the venue tracing, it's gonna be much harder to do it well. But they're not going to understand until it's explained to them. Right? And even if it's explained, they will want to see some data to be convinced. And even if they get some data, they will criticize because, well, it's only a partial view. You only got to see that it was spreading in the clubs because that's where you're measuring things. So you only see the propagation in the clubs. You don't see it in the fitness or whatever. So it's going to be a lot of that. And I think we're going to be stuck in this for a while.
Okay, so if we have no further question, I'd like
one more.
Oh, one more.
Yeah, fine.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Personally, I really see the difference. I won't contradict any of the mechanisms you're talking about, but I see a general difference between East and West in terms of mindset. And I've seen it, it corresponds to what I've read in, he talked about the black swan in the crisis. Nassim Taleb, he talks about how to Western mind has become too unchained from practical things, too theoretical. So we have academia, which is outside of the world. And so we have all these beautiful papers coming from Harvard, Oxford, and so on. They're coming 6 months too late. They're telling things in more detail that the Japanese contact tracers, they understood this like practically and acted in February. Now we have papers explaining what they did in more detail and with beautiful graph and everything. But it's too late. I mean, it's too late. We already suffered too much. It's good to have it.
Well, it is too late in the sense that at some point the epidemic had died down, and those measures are much more impactful when the level is very low.
Yeah, true.
So in that sense, it becomes the wrong time to try to apply them.
Yeah, but I'll go even further. We don't actually need those papers to solve the epidemic. We need them because we need science. We need them for future pandemics and so on. But per se, we didn't need all this knowledge, this refined knowledge to act. From what I've read, the Japanese, they did contact tracing intensely from the beginning. Koreans did it with electronics. Japanese did it with people, and both found that this cluster thing that you have to go after clusters. They found it. They did it, and the epidemic didn't go too high up, so they kept it under control, and that's it. Learn their lesson, and then they adjust, fine tune. Sometimes they close all the clubs for 1 month in Tokyo because it goes up too much, then it gets under control.
Yeah, but it's not like a decision is taken and then everything follows from that decision. Look, social pass was deployed, and then now many people are fighting against it. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but they're rejecting it. It's not because someone decided that QR codes were important and so on that everything will follow from that, right? You have to get buy-in from the population. And it's not just that someone understood cluster is important, cluster tracing is important. It's also that the population understood it already because it had already lived it.
But I think people don't understand. They just see that in their country it's working, and they look on TV and they see the United States, they see France, they see Spain, they see, okay, I will accept what my government is telling me because it works. I think it doesn't go that far in reflection as you people like you and maybe me think.
Sure.
See what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't think the recommendations of the OFS, the Federal Office of Public Health, say that aerosols are dangerous. For instance, they still don't say that.
They don't.
So it's in a sense, But I did tell my wife, don't stay in a room where you feel it's not well ventilated, because I've read information from elsewhere, and even before it was like scientifically confirmed, it was, but sometimes I did get it wrong, because I told her as well, like, don't take ibuprofen, because I know she takes it a lot. And at some point it was like, seemed to be correlated with bad results for young people. But that was invalidated later on.
But you say there's a problem with compliance and measures. I see people obeying most things. I mean, you see anti-masks in the media, but I don't see anyone without a mask in the bus. Like, very few people. So most people, even if
I don't think
are rebelling in words, in acts, they're not really rebelling.
Okay, so
except when they have to give their context, then
they're not true. I think you're missing an important element: is which measures are visible.
Yeah,
the compliance, which compliance is visible or not. So in the mask, everyone who sees, whether Swiss COVID is installed or not, no one does. So that's a huge effect in terms of adoption. But also the lists, the contact tracing list in a restaurant, like when you have to enter, most of them are not filled. People don't fill them, right? If it's not mandatory, they will not do it. If you're told, like in Belgium right now, in Belgium they have a bubble of 1. That means you can touch one person, right? This is so bad that this is the limitation. Like you can not socially distance from one person outside of your household. But most likely this is not respected by most people. In their private, at home, they don't care. It's still an obligation, but it's not respected.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up here. Paul-Olivier, thank you very, very much for coming here and sharing with us. All the best for the following work. We hope to hear from you soon. in whatever capacity you may have. Thank you for all watching online, and have a safe evening.
Merci.